From New York, this is Democracy Now!
I especially appreciate the support of our friend U.S. President Joe Biden for the state of Israel's right to self-defense. I am determined to continue this operation until its objective is achieved, to restore quiet and security to you, the citizens of Israel.
Israel's bombing of Gaza continues as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejects growing calls for a ceasefire while thanking President Biden for his support. This comes as the U.S. is opposing a fourth resolution at the UN Security Council calling for a ceasefire, this one from France. But pressure is growing on Biden to do more to stop the assault.
I believe that we should be mourning the loss of Israeli life, but we should also be mourning the loss of Palestinian lives. Or perhaps some people think that Palestinian lives don't matter. I would hope not.
We'll speak to longtime Israeli journalist Gideon Levy and Palestinian human rights attorney and legal scholar Noura Erakat. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Israel's continued its ferocious bombing and shelling campaign on the Gaza Strip for an 11th straight day, bringing the Palestinian death toll to at least 231, including 65 children. Earlier this morning, Israeli forces bombed the crowded Jabalia refugee camp. Palestinian health officials say 1,700 Palestinians have been wounded. Over 1,300 housing units have been completely demolished or severely damaged. Israeli authorities say 12 people have been killed inside Israel from rockets fired from Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has so far rejected calls for a ceasefire, but Hamas officials say a truce could be reached within a day. In the West Bank, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas demanded an end to the Israeli attack and Israel's occupation.
What the occupation is doing in Gaza, including vicious attacks on civilians, deliberate shelling of residential areas and institutions, destruction of infrastructure, as well as the killing of women, elderly, and children, is organized state terrorism, carried out by the Israeli occupation, and war crimes punishable by international law.
On Wednesday, President Biden spoke to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu again and reportedly told him that he, quote, expected a significant de-escalation today on the path to a ceasefire, unquote. But the Biden administration also said the same day it would block a United Nations Security Council resolution proposed by France calling for an end to violence and humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip. The U.S. has blocked at least 3 other such attempts at the UN since Israel's bombing campaign began 11 days ago. On Capitol Hill, Senator Bernie Sanders Wednesday introduced a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire and supporting diplomatic efforts to protect human rights and to uphold international law. Sanders blasted a competing Republican-led resolution for failing to express sympathy for the killing of Palestinians.
The loss of 12 innocent Israeli lives is, in fact, a tragedy. But what about the loss of 227 Palestinian lives, including 64 children and 38 women?
Today, Senator Sanders is expected to introduce a resolution of disapproval on a planned $735 million U.S. sale of precision-guided weapons to Israel. A similar resolution in the House was co-sponsored by Democrats Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Mark Pocan, and Rashida Tlaib, the first Palestinian-American congresswoman. Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, quote, "The United States should not be rubber-stamping weapons sales to the Israeli government as they deploy our resources to target international media outlets, schools, hospitals, humanitarian missions, and civilian sites for bombing," unquote. After headlines, we'll spend the rest of the hour on the crisis in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. India reported another 3,800 coronavirus deaths Thursday, just 24 hours after setting a new single-day record high for the pandemic with over 4,500 COVID deaths. India's massive second wave appears to have crested, but the nation is still reporting more than 250,000 cases per day. In recent days, hundreds more corpses of COVID-19 victims have been discovered floating in the Ganges River, adding to evidence that Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government is concealing the true toll from its failed response to the crisis. India's official death toll now stands at over 287,000, though public health experts say the real number could be up to 5 times higher. Here in New York, Mayor Bill de Blasio joined a ribbon-cutting ceremony at the celebrity chef Daniel Boulud's newest Manhattan restaurant Wednesday, celebrating the return of indoor dining at 100% capacity for the first time since March of 2020.
This is the largest restaurant reopening since the pandemic. This is a symbol of New York City coming back right here, right now.
Daily U.S. coronavirus cases continue to decline, even as the pace of U.S. vaccinations continues to slow. There were fewer than 30,000 new cases reported nationwide Wednesday. Meanwhile, the European Union says it will reopen its borders to fully vaccinated travelers. On Wednesday, French President Emmanuel Macron shared a drink at an outdoor Paris cafe with France's prime minister to celebrate the partial reopening of restaurants. More than 3 in 10 people in France have received at least one shot of a COVID-19 vaccine. The House of Representatives approved a bill Wednesday to create a bipartisan commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. 35 Republicans joined Democrats in favor of the bill. Indiana Congressmember Greg Pence, the brother of former Vice President Mike Pence, voted against the bill, even though Vice President Pence had to be evacuated with family on January 6th as the mob of insurrectionists called for him to be hanged. The measure's fate now rests in the Senate, where Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has vowed to oppose it, as the House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy also opposed it. Elsewhere on Capitol Hill, 3 survivors of one of the worst racial terror attacks in U.S. history testified to Congress Wednesday in favor of reparations ahead of the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. Over 2 days, beginning May 31st, 1921, racist white mobs set fire to homes, businesses, and churches in Greenwood, a thriving African-American business district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street. 107-year-old Viola Fletcher is the oldest living survivor. She testified.
I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not, and other survivors do not, and our descendants do not.
A warning to our audience, this next headline contains disturbing footage of police violence. The Associated Press has obtained video of Louisiana state troopers electrocuting, beating, and dragging Ronald Green, a black man, who was killed during a 2019 traffic stop in Monroe, Louisiana. AP released portions of the 46-minute video showing one officer putting Green in a chokehold and punching him in the face, while another can be heard calling him a stupid MFer. He uses the full word. After the beating, AP reports the officers left Green unattended, moaning and face down for more than 9 minutes as officers refused to render aid, instead washing blood off their hands and faces. Ronald Green arrived dead at an area hospital with 2 taser prongs in his back. Police initially told Green's family he died of a car crash. Green's families filed a federal wrongful death lawsuit. A North Carolina jury has awarded $75 million in damages to compensate 2 brothers who spent more than 3 decades in prison after they were falsely convicted of rape and murder. Henry McCullum and Leon Brown, who are both black and have intellectual disabilities, were sentenced to death over confessions that for years they said were coerced. They were released in 2014 after an investigation by the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission found DNA evidence implicated another man in the crimes. Texas carried out its first execution in 10 months on Wednesday night, administering a lethal injection to 41-year-old Quentin Jones, a black man convicted for killing his great-aunt in 1999. Jones had pleaded with the Texas governor to spare his life in a viral video produced by the New York Times. The victim's family had forgiven Jones and publicly opposed the execution, including signing a petition for clemency. In a shocking move, there were no media witnesses present during Jones' execution. A spokesperson said news staff failed to tell reporters it was time to carry out the lethal injection, and so they were left waiting in an office across the street while Jones was executed. Executives from biotech company Emergent Biosolutions were grilled by lawmakers Wednesday over multiple failures in the manufacturing of coronavirus vaccines, which led the company to throw out 15 million doses earlier this year due to contamination. This is New York Congressmember Carolyn Maloney speaking at the hearing Wednesday.
This is unfair to the American taxpayer, to say the very least. When you have a contract, you should produce the product. So far, we haven't even gotten one dose of the product out to the American taxpayer. Yet you have been able to get bonuses, millions of dollars in pay going out to executives, and they have not completed the contract.
Former government officials serve on the board of Emergent, and the company spends an average of $3 million a year on lobbying lawmakers. A massive sheet of ice, 4 times the size of New York City, has broken free from Antarctica's Ron ice shelf, becoming the world's largest iceberg. Though such events are part of a natural cycle, scientists warn greenhouse gas emissions and other forms of air pollution are warming the Earth's polar regions faster than the rest of the globe, threatening wildlife and contributing to rising sea levels. In Britain, scientists with the group Extinction Rebellion locked themselves to an exhibit at the London Science Museum Wednesday to protest its sponsorship by oil company Shell. Climate activists also staged an oil, quote, cleanup outside the museum. One of the protesters said, quote, Shell is using the Science Museum to legitimize its crimes. And McDonald's workers across the United States held a strike Wednesday to demand a minimum wage of $15 an hour. Senator Bernie Sanders and Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were some of the high-profile supporters who joined a virtual action in solidarity with the workers. Congressmember Ocasio-Cortez called on McDonald's to require all of its franchise locations to set a minimum wage of at least $15 an hour.
Because they are a leader in this industry, and their actions set the tone and set the standard for so many other competitors as well. And so you're not just fighting for you and yourselves, you are fighting for food workers across this country to be paid a living wage and to be able to get the union that they deserve.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A Palestinian man in a wheelchair, his pregnant wife and 3-year-old daughter are among the latest victims in Israel's devastating bombing and shelling campaign in Gaza. On Wednesday, an Israeli missile struck the home of Ayad Salah as he and his family were preparing for lunch. Israeli airstrikes and shelling have killed at least 231 Palestinians, including 65 children, over the past 11 days. 1,700 Palestinians have been wounded. Israeli authorities say 12 people have died inside Israel from rockets fired from Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has so far rejected calls for a ceasefire, but Hamas officials say a truce could be reached within a day. On Wednesday, President Biden spoke to Netanyahu and reportedly told him he, quote, expected a significant de-escalation today on the path to a ceasefire. Despite Biden's request, Israel continues to bomb Gaza. Earlier this morning, Israel bombed the crowded Jabalia refugee camp. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, the United States is continuing to oppose efforts at the UN Security Council to call for a ceasefire. France has circulated a new resolution, but the United States has already come out against it. The U.S. previously blocked 3 other UN Security Council resolutions and statements. On Wednesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu thanked President Biden for his support.
I especially appreciate the support of our friend U.S. President Joe Biden for the state of Israel's right to self-defense. I am determined to continue this operation until its objective is achieved, to restore quiet and security to you, the citizens of Israel.
Meanwhile, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas spoke Wednesday demanding an end to the Israeli attack and the occupation.
Our work is now focused on stopping the Israeli aggression against our people in Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza, then entering a serious political process under clear international backing that leads to ending the Israeli occupation of the lands in the state of Palestine, including East Jerusalem, our revered capital, and reaching a full and fair solution that is agreed upon for the refugees according to Resolution 194 to achieve fair peace in the region.
We're joined now by two guests. Noura Erakat is a Palestinian human rights attorney and legal scholar. She's an assistant professor at Rutgers University, author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. She's joining us from Fairfax, Virginia. And in Tel Aviv, we're joined by Gideon Levy, an award-winning Israeli journalist and author, a columnist for the newspaper Haaretz, and a member of its editorial board. He's also the author of the book, The Punishment of Gaza. Gideon Levy, let us begin with you. You have written piece after piece on what's taking place right now. We have just talked about the latest of a number of conversations the President of the United States, President Biden, has had with the indicted, sitting on trial for corruption, Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu. Now, it is known that they are not the best of friends. Obviously, Netanyahu was very close to President Trump. But even with this lack of friendship, it sounds like he couldn't have right now a better friend than Biden, who has repeatedly at the United Nations stopped UN Security Council resolution after resolution calling for a ceasefire, the latest one from France. Can you talk about the significance of the U.S. Israeli relationship, especially now with the Biden administration expediting $735 million worth of precision-guided missiles to Israel in the midst of Israel's bombardment of Gaza, with Netanyahu saying they don't plan to end this anytime soon?
Good morning, Amy. It's unbelievable how things repeat themselves. Administrations are changing. Prime ministers in Israel are changing, reality is changing, and the traditional policy of backing Israel automatically and blindly, supporting it and financing it and arming it does not change. Now, you see, Amy, it's not about talking anymore. I mean, Israel learned to live also with condemnations. The State Department might condemn. Even the Security Council can condemn. It's time to move to deeds. Because if we want really to stop all this, Israel must feel it. Israel must be taken accountable for those crimes. Israel must pay for those crimes. And I don't see any intention of moving from talkings to deeds. Joe Biden, I'm sure his heart is in the right place. So was Barack Obama, obviously. But by the end of the day, they are supporting all this. What does he mean, the American president, that Israel has the right to protect itself? Sure, it has the right to protect itself. But at any price, with any means, without any restraints. I mean, when will be the stage in which the world or the American president will say enough is enough? This is not self-protection, killing 70 children. This is not self-protection to destroy again and again Gaza. And above all, it doesn't serve Israel.
Explain how it doesn't serve Israel, and what is the Israeli popular response right now, the response of the Israeli population?
This is maybe the most depressive side of it, except of the horrible scenes from Gaza. Because you look at Israeli media, and you look at Israeli public opinion, and the Israeli discourse, and you hear only one voice, a voice of cheering to the fighting, of asking for more, of asking for more blood, of supporting the IDF in an unconditioned way, no criticism, and above all, no real information, because the Israeli average viewer, TV viewer, didn't see nothing of Gaza. You see here and there those towers falling down. It's very photogenic, but nothing about the sacrifice, nothing about the agony, nothing about the families, nothing about the suffer, the children, everything. Israelis don't see it, which helps them to feel so good about themselves and to feel so just about themselves. But by the end of the day, this is brainwash. This denial is also part of the brainwash system, namely that all Gaza is Hamas, that everything that the IDF is doing is moral, and that they deserve all this, and they are to be taken accountable for everything happens. If you ask any Israeli, he will tell you it's only the fault of the Hamas. And then you ask him, is there any kind of accountability, responsibility, moral responsibility of Israel? Not at all. We have the most moral army in the world.
I want to bring in Noura Erakat, Palestinian human rights attorney, legal scholar, assistant professor at Rutgers University, author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. Hundreds of Palestinians have died in Gaza, have been killed in the Israeli military bombardment of this enclave, of extremely crowded, of millions of people. In the United States, in the corridors of power, the Biden White House, yet still has so much sway over what Israel does because it is the largest recipient of U.S. military aid in the world. Yet we are seeing a fracturing of the Democratic Party, and Noura Erakat, and you have a front row seat here, being in the United States. Can you talk about whether this has surprised you? Does it make a difference to you as Palestinians die? And the U.S., of course, that has the first now Palestinian-American congresswoman in U.S. history, Rashida Tlaib, who on Eid al-Fitr gave a powerful address on the floor of the House wearing a keffiyeh.
Thank you, Amy. I want to emphasize that even when Palestinians aren't dying, that the Israeli campaign targeting farmlands, targeting medical specialists, targeting roads to hospitals, targeting schools, targeting clinics, targeting bookstores, all of that reduces the chances of life. So even if Palestinian life is spared in their flesh, they have limited chances of survival or horizons for that life. And so we should emphasize the structural nature of these attacks. I've been very pleased and heartened by this shift in U.S. politics, though not completely surprised. The progressive, what they call the progressive insurgency within Congress, and specifically the progressive flank of the Democratic Party, reflects years of movement work on the ground, where prior to even the words intersectional emerged that emphasize the entwinements of joint struggle, of our joint survival and our joint resistance between indigenous, Black, brown communities, have brought these new lawmakers to power, so that the analysis that they are sharing with us now on the House floor both reflects those grassroots constituencies, as well as the analysis that's been forged in the crucible of struggle. For example, Representative Cori Bush, who came to Washington on the shoulders of movement in Ferguson, Missouri, gave a moving speech on the House floor in dedication to a fallen warrior, Bassem Masri. And she emphasized there that Black and Palestinian solidarity is real, and there is a commitment, not because of some theoretical framework, but because of the work they did on the ground during the Ferguson Gaza moment, during the occupation of Ferguson in 2014 and the simultaneous bombardment of Gaza, when it became clear and evident that Israeli and U.S. state violence are not the same, but quite similar, and operate through similar circuits of capital and profit. The fact that U.S. police officers from Ferguson were trained by Israeli army personnel and Israeli police, the fact that similar technologies are used in U.S. prisons as well as Israeli prisons for surveillance, the fact that similar tactics of racial profiling are used, the fact that excess weapons from U.S. war-making in the Middle East, its endless war-making in the Middle East, are then distributed to local law enforcement offices here in the United States, makes clear that this is not about self-defense, that this is not merely about a struggle for civil rights, but that this is about state violence and oppression meant to maintain the supremacy of one racial group above all. And so I'm excited by this shift in Congress, though not surprised, and hope to see more of it as grassroots movements continue to take leaders to Washington.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. We have an hour with our guest, Noura Erakat, Palestinian human rights attorney and legal scholar here in the United States, and Gideon Levy, speaking to us from Tel Aviv, Israeli journalist and columnist for Haaretz and a member of its editorial board. We're also going to hear from the head of B'Tselem, the leading Israeli human rights organization, and Angela Davis, expressing solidarity with the Palestinian people. Stay with us. Instrumental by Taj Mahal. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As Israel faces international condemnation for its assault on Gaza, we turn to look at growing accusations that Israel is an apartheid state. Earlier this week, New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "Apartheid states aren't democracies." In March, the organization Human Rights Watch said for the first time Israel's committing the crimes of apartheid and persecution in the occupied Palestinian territories. Before that, in January, the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem issued a report titled "A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is Apartheid." Earlier this week, I spoke with Haggai Elad, executive director of B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, and I asked him about this landmark report.
B'Tselem was founded back in 1989. We've been analyzing human rights violations in occupied territories since then, for more than 3 decades by now. And throughout this period, we've only looked at human rights violations in the occupied territories, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and in the Gaza Strip. We came to the conclusion that continue to analyze the situation separately, as if there are two distinct regimes, a democracy inside the Green Line and a temporary occupation attached to it, but somehow separate from it in the occupied territories on the other side of the Green Line, that worldview of democracy plus occupation has become untethered from reality. And it's incumbent on us to be factual and to wake up to reality. If one desires to continue to hold on to that big lie, then you need to ignore a lot of things. You need to ignore the passage of time, that Israeli control over the entire territory has been going on for more than 50 years. You need to ignore the fact that there are more than 600,000 Israeli Jewish settlers living on the other side of the Green Line in the occupied West Bank as if they're living inside Israel proper. You need to ignore the fact that part of the occupied territory has been formally annexed. I'm talking about East Jerusalem, with the rest of it being de facto annexed. You need to set aside a lot of facts in order to continue to hold on to that bankrupt worldview. But the key thing is that to hold on to that, you need to ignore the key aspect, which is there is one organizing principle that is applied by the Israeli regime between the river and the sea, and that principle is the supremacy and domination of one group of people, Jews, over another group of people, Palestinians. With all this happening in a situation of demographic parity. There are 14 million people that live between the river and the sea. About half of them are Jews, about half of them are Palestinians, but the system, the regime is structured so that that demographic parity will not translate into parity in political power or in access to the resources of this land or to protection or rights. Now, one of the most important aspects of this reality has been Israel's ability to fragment this space for Palestinians while keeping it intact for Jews, right? So if you're a Jewish individual like myself, no matter where you live between the river and the sea, whether it's inside Israel proper or in the occupied territories, the state will, within one of the more than 200 illegal settlements that Israel has already established in the last half century plus, then the state will do everything in its power to provide you with the same set of rights, privileges, and protections, right? So that's the treatment for Jewish Israelis. But for Palestinians, it makes a very big difference if you live as a second-class citizen inside the Green Line or as a permanent resident in occupied and illegally annexed East Jerusalem, or in the rest of the West Bank as a Palestinian subject, or one of the 2 million Palestinians that are living in that large open-air prison that is the Gaza Strip. So there are different categories of Palestinians, and from Israel's perspective, and in each and every one of those, there is a different subset of rights, always less rights, always a degree of oppression, but nowhere between the river and the sea, there's a single square inch in which a Jewish person and a Palestinian are equal. It is always structured in this way that domination and supremacy for the Jewish half of the population. And it's incumbent on us to connect the dots. So let me try and do that. Look at Israel's bombings of Gaza. Do these strike you as proportional? Look at Israel's occupation of the West Bank. Does it strike you as temporary? Look at Israel's drive to cleanse East Jerusalem neighborhoods from Palestinians. Does that strike you as legal? Look at Israel's oppression of Palestinian citizens as second class. Does that strike you as equal treatment under the law? It's not proportional. It's not temporary. It's not legal. It's not equal. And it's not complicated. Believe your eyes. Follow your conscience. The reason that it looks like apartheid is simply because it is apartheid.
Guy Elad, what is the response within the Israeli Jewish population to your critique now, calling what's happening in Gaza war crimes, and to your apartheid report from January?
Yeah, I mean, the response is definitely not welcoming or popular in any shape or form, which also is not new. But fighting for human rights is not a popularity contest, and I am encouraged by the way in which, first internationally, the understanding that the situation here is apartheid is becoming more and more mainstreamed. This is the result of efforts by Palestinian colleagues, Palestinian scholars and NGOs and activists have been making this point already for many years, right? And then much more recently, the B'Tselem report in January and the Human Rights Watch, very broad legal determination that Israeli officials are guilty of the crimes of apartheid and persecution in April. And I think thanks to that, and thanks to reality being what it is, and it becoming less and less possible to obscure it and to hide it and to continue to lie about it, we're hearing key figures in U.S. politics and media saying the truth out loud. And with that, I think it will also eventually resonate back here. And Jewish Israelis will need to come to terms with the fact that the world is waking up to what is going on. And that's really the essential aspect, because what is happening now in Gaza, it has to stop. this kind of bombings. It just has to stop. That's the most essential aspect to save human lives. But that's not sufficient. The people responsible need to be held accountable, because otherwise it's just going to be allowed to continue the same way that has been allowed to continue, which has brought us to this assault on the Gaza Strip. But also it's essential that we do not go back to the status quo. The status quo is a false term. It's never static. And the status quo is not justice. The status quo is apartheid. So yes, the bloodshed that is happening now has to stop. But the bloodshed is related to the underlying reality, to the overarching reality, to the condition of apartheid that has to end.
That's Haggai Elad, Executive Director of the human rights group B'Tselem. He's speaking to us from Jerusalem. To see the full interview, you can go to democracynow.org, and we'll link to the B'Tselem report, a regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid. This is Democracy Now! We're spending the hour with Noura Erakat, the Palestinian-American human rights attorney and legal scholar, and Gidon Levy, Israeli journalist, columnist for Haaretz, member of the Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper's editorial board. Gidon, one of your recent pieces is headlined, "We can keep lying to ourselves on apartheid, but Israel has crossed the line." Talk about the sensitivity of Israel to this accusation. Palestinians and many others around the world have leveled it for a long time. It's increasingly been adopted, that term, by mainstream organizations like Human Rights Watch, and we just saw B'Tselem. The significance of calling it this and how it changes.
Unfortunately, it's a very, very, very slow process, and the way is still long to go, very long to go. Because, Amy, Israel, as you know, is a society in total denial. People live here in denial. I cannot recall one society which lives in such a denial like the Israeli Jewish society in the last 20 years or so. Nothing from the occupation gets into our daily life. The occupation seems to be somewhere else, beyond the oceans, in another continent, if at all. Israeli life is not affected by the occupation, not affected by the apartheid. We live our lives in our bubble, which is very pleasant and even, I would say, very democratic. And nobody cares to know what happens 15 minutes away from our homes, half an hour away from our homes. Most of Israelis never travel there. Most of the Israelis are not informed about what's going on there. And the information which does get to Israelis is always this official false information portraying the Palestinians always as the terrorists, nothing but terrorists, and portraying us as the ultimate victims, the only victims. Even now, when we are speaking now, most of the Israelis are sure that the big victims in this war are the Israelis because they have to sit in shelters. The fact that the people of Gaza don't even have shelters doesn't cross the mind of anybody, doesn't touch to the heart of anybody. It is so hard to make Israelis feel something about the Palestinians. See them as human beings is a luxury here because most of the Israelis don't see it. Tell them about dead children. What can you say about the fact that out of over 200 victims, almost 100 are women and children? Can you still claim that this is inevitable? Can you still claim that this is moral? Can you still claim that they were terrorists? No. But do you think that anybody is shaken by this in Israeli society or even in Israeli media? Nothing. Because we live in denial, and therefore, as long as people will call us apartheid, so immediately they are labeled as anti-Semites. So it's their fault, not our fault. And Israel will continue to live in this denial, even though, it penetrates slowly, much too slow into the discourse.
Noura Erakat, you have Hamas and other militant Palestinian groups shooting something like 3,000 missiles into Israel. 12 people in Israel have died, 2 of them Thai migrant workers. You have Israel bombing Gaza. Hundreds of Palestinians have died, more than 60 children killed by the Israeli attack. You have described what's happened in Gaza Strip as an outright massacre. Can you talk about the effect on the ground? And you have a friend, for example, who is a Harvard Law graduate, who just lost 15 members of his family. Describe this to us, and then the overall context of what is happening for people to understand this, what David Cameron, the former British Prime Minister, described as an open-air prison, Gaza.
Thank you for lifting up the story of Hussam al-Kulaq, who is the Harvard Law graduate and a dear friend of mine. Numbers indicate that he actually lost 21 members of his family, the eldest being age 90, the youngest being age 6 months. This is 4 generations of Palestinians wiped out in a single instance. That is more death in terms of civilian casualties in one strike than Hamas has meted out in this current conflagration. The important thing I want to emphasize about Hussam's story is that he hasn't met his family. He's based in the United States and is not granted entry. This is a feature of Palestinian life, which is the forced fragmentation between Palestinians aimed at undermining the singular national identity of Palestinians as an indigenous population to this land. He intended to meet them and now cannot upon his return to Palestine. What's even more tragic is that he and his family, or his parents anyway, had fled Gaza to the United States for chances of better life, and yet their pursuit of that life in the United States, which is the primary patron of Israel, primary imperial patron, is part of the structure, as is my life in the United States, and yours, and everyone who is watching here from the United States is part of the structure on violence that continues to be meted against Gaza. I want to emphasize something about Israel's use of force. There is no parity here. We understand that. In regards to Israel, Hamas rockets, I also want to emphasize that we should distinguish that Hamas may be using rockets that can't target, and you can critique that for its recklessness, and it too can be tantamount to a war crime. But they have already been punished. They have been designated as terror organizations by the United States and the EU. They have been subject to siege. It becomes redundant and irrelevant to continue to condemn that and demand some sort of false parity. What I want to emphasize about Israel's use of force is within the framework of jus ad bellum. Israel does not have the right to self-defense against a population that it occupies. It cannot usurp law enforcement power from the native population, impose a siege, govern the airspace, govern the seaports, govern the perimeter, govern entrance and exit, govern how much caloric intake Palestinians have, and then shoot missiles onto a besieged population. It cannot do both. This has been established by legal scholars such as Christine Gray on the law of self-defense. It is an old trope that was condemned in the 1970s when Portugal, South Africa, and Israel tried to claim the right to self-defense in order to protect its colonial territories. You cannot dominate another people and then use the claim of self-defense in order to protect that domination. Israel is not protecting itself or its citizens. It is protecting its domination. It is protecting its occupation. So the first thing that needs to happen in the aftermath, one, this is a form of aggression, but the first thing that needs to happen in any outcome after this is that the siege must be lifted. We cannot endure another scene like this, another massacre where it becomes theater for politics and news media, and then not demand that the siege be lifted as the bare minimum of what happens next.
We're going to break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the issue of solidarity. Angela Davis recently released a statement on what's happening in Palestine. We're speaking with Noura Erakat, who is a Palestinian-American scholar, assistant professor at Rutgers University. Gideon Levy is with us from Tel Aviv, Israeli journalist, award-winning columnist for Haaretz, sits on the Israeli newspaper's editorial board. Stay with us. Basil Wahed. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Sunday, many Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian communities boycotted President Biden's virtual Eid celebration. A letter to the White House from the Muslim Delegates and Allies Coalition said, quote, in lieu of flowers or condolences for martyred Palestinian children or even a White House Eid celebration, we request the United States recognize dignity rights worldwide. A first step in recognizing our humanity would be to not allow a policy of mass slaughter in the sacred Islamic month of Ramadan. We turn now to the legendary activist and scholar Angela Davis, author of many books, including Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of Movement. She recorded this message of solidarity for an event on Sunday called Eid with Palestine, a protest of the White House Eid event.
I join the many individuals and organizations around the world in expressing grief and anger and protest in light of the acceleration of violence by the Israeli government and the settlers they protect in Sheikh Jarrah. We protest the storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the extensive and brutal bombing of Gaza. And we call attention to and protest the Biden-Harris administration's collusion with the Israeli government, even as the Biden government participated in the celebration of Eid. And at a time when Palestinians the world over have been commemorating the Nakba. People all over the U.S. and indeed throughout the world expressed their outrage when George Floyd's and Breonna Taylor's lives were extinguished by racist police violence. We know that shortly after these murders occurred, Ahmad Erakat was shot down on his sister's wedding day at a checkpoint between Bethlehem and Abu Dis outside of occupied East Jerusalem. This was clearly a state-sanctioned execution that we now recognize as a harbinger of the current violent assaults on Palestinians in East Jerusalem and Gaza, where over 100 people, including children, have already been killed. This is unconscionable. In 2011, I had the opportunity to visit Sheikh Jarrah with a delegation of indigenous and women of color activists, scholars, and artists. We talked with a Palestinian family who had been evicted from their home where they had lived for many decades. Jewish settlers had moved into the main rooms of their house, and they, the rightful owners, were relegated to a small area in the back of the house. Progressive Jews were conducting demonstrations every week to protest the eviction of Palestinians from their homes. What we witnessed 10 years ago is now happening on a much larger and more threatening scale. We should now understand that as these evictions continue, they prove that Israeli settler colonialism will only be halted when people all over the world demand that the rights of the Palestinian people in occupied Palestine be respected. Here in the U.S., we must make our demands for justice in Palestine resonate as powerfully as our demands for an end to racist police violence. Stop the evictions, stop the demolitions, stop the bombing, and end the occupation. Justice for Palestine.
That's Professor Angela Davis. She and our guest, Noura Erakat, were part of a conversation published in The Nation magazine. Was the killing of Ahmad Erakat an extrajudicial execution? And Angela referenced his death. And I wanted, Noura, for you to, if you could, because I know it is still so painful, talk about your cousin, the investigation you have done of his death at an Israeli checkpoint, and then as we begin to wrap up, put that in the larger context of what's happening today in the occupied territories.
Thank you for lifting up Ahmad Erakat. My cousin, again, he was shot at a checkpoint separating two Palestinian cities, Abu Dis and Bethlehem, on the day of his sister's wedding. He had a mechanical error in the car, shot dead 6 times above the waist in 2 seconds with his arms above his head, left on the pavement, even as the Israeli ambulance came to treat the lightly wounded Israeli soldier manning the checkpoint. Refused to treat Ahmad. His body was not moved. The Israeli army also refused to allow Palestinian ambulance to treat him. The car was compounded. There was no autopsy conducted on his body, and he remains in an Israeli refrigerator at Tel Aviv University, held hostage to punish the family as well as other Palestinians in a sign that even after death, they will be treated cruelly. He is one of 62 Palestinians held in this way in response to our advocacy to just get the body back. That included the forensic architecture investigation that demonstrated scene by scene that Ahmad was probably decelerating, far from accelerating, was decelerating as the car comes out of control in response to mobilizing the Erakat family across the United States who have also sought refuge here. 6 senators we asked to intervene on the family's behalf with the Israeli government. In response, Defense Minister Benny Gantz became more cruel and said not only would they not release the body, but that they would dig up Palestinian bodies accused of participating in resistance activities to hold them hostage as well. The way that this fits within the larger frame has to do with Israel's expanding use of force. We have to be careful when we're calling for international law and to describe what Israel is doing as war crimes, because Israel's work is also in the battle of changing what the law means. It is shrinking who counts as a Palestinian civilian. It regards Palestinians as already always being a threat until proven innocent. All Palestinians are deemed a threat for their mere existence and challenging the Zionist settler colonial mythology of uninterrupted Jewish spatial and temporal presence. What we see happen to Ahmad has been a pattern and practice that the UN has documented and said that Israel shoots as a matter of precautionary measure. In some cases, they have placed weapons alongside the Palestinian bodies. We saw this manifest most cruelly during the Gaza March of Return when snipers shot down hundreds of Palestinian Gandhis, so to speak. For all those who keep saying, if only Palestinians would be peaceful, we have been nothing but. The question to ask is, how have Palestinians not been more violent, frankly, given this atrocious treatment? They shot hundreds of Palestinians, 90% of which in the head, in the neck, in the back, in the torso, as they were fleeing medics, children. And the Israeli Supreme Court said that this was justified because even the peaceful protests are, quote unquote, Hamas's new tactic of warfare against Israel. They have securitized our entire life, our entire existence, and the bare minimum of what an international community watching now that just cares about the violence during these spectacular moments. If you really, really sincerely care about the violence, you must place sanctions on Israel. You must demilitarize Israel. You must force Israel to sign the non-nuclear proliferation treaty. You must hold Israel to account. Otherwise, you are only asking Palestinians to die quietly.
I want to go now to Gideon Levy in Tel Aviv. As you listen to Noura Erakat, your latest piece in Haaretz, a pampered Israel carries out violence because it can. If the U.S., if Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the first Palestinian-American Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, succeeded in stopping the expediting of $735 million of precision-guided weapons to Israel, would this have an effect? Or Senator Sanders calling for a ceasefire? What kind of impact does this have on Israeli society? Do you think this could stop the bloodshed?
Let me tell you, Amy, that if there would have been an administration, American administration, who would like not only to stop this violence, but to put an end to the occupation, it could do so within months. The problem is that we never faced an administration who was really decisive or was really caring about the continuance of the status quo. You know, Biden is now labeled as Israel as a hostile president. This war, Joe Biden is signed on this war quite a lot, because if it would be a decisive American president, he would put an end to it at once. Don't forget that Israel is so dependent on the United States, politically, militarily, and financially. But Israel learned that the United States is in its pocket, that the support is unconditioned, that the money will come and the check is open no matter what Israel does. That's the lesson of Israel after many years. And that's the way that the United States had corrupted Israel. Because if you get this free supply of arms, like a free supply of drugs, you become addicted and you become totally corrupted, because you know there are no one to put limits to your behavior. What I wrote today in Haaretz was that Israel is by far too strong. Would Israel be less strong, it would be much of a moral state. Because Israelis are not bloodthirsty, they are not monsters. But they do all those things because nobody stops them, because this overall power makes people arrogant. They can provoke the Palestinians in Jerusalem, and they can kill Ahmed Arikat in the checkpoint, and they can continue to steal their land and to do all those things, and the world just hugs Israel. And if the world hugs Israel, Israel continues. There will be no resistance from within Israel. I mean, Israelis will never wake up one shining morning and say, oh, this is not so nice, this occupation, let's put an end to it. Why would they, after 53 years in which they were told that without the occupation, Israel will not survive? We have 5 seconds. Just my last sentence. The only way to put an end to it is to make Israelis pay and be punished, and then it will be their choice if they are ready to take this price. And I can assure you, most of the Israelis then will say no.
Gideon Levy, Israeli journalist, columnist for Haaretz, a member of the editorial board of the paper, and Noura Erakat, Palestinian-American human rights attorney and legal scholar.